Molly Scott Cato, and our thanks to her for agreeing to give this talk for us this evening. Molly is the spokesperson on finance and economics for the Green Party of England and Wales, and she is also a professor of economics. She has written many books, including on the subject of universal basic income, which is what her talk this evening is going to be about. Universal basic income is something which the Green Party has had on its agenda for many years. And just recently, it's been much talked about, and a number of local authorities have passed resolutions asking for their area to have a pilot universal basic income scheme. So it is very topical. I've heard Molly speak before. I know it will be lively and informative and stimulating. Just some technical things, please. While Molly is talking, we're going to turn off the chat facility. But if you have a technical problem or something else urgent, you will be able to send a message to me and to Evelyn, and we'll do our best to sort it out. And after Molly has spoken, there will be plenty of time for questions. We're going to finish at 9 o'clock, but there will be plenty of time for questions. But unless you are asking your question, we would ask you please to remain muted. So, Molly, please, we are ready to listen to you on the subject of universal basic income.
Thank you very much, Gary, and thanks to all of you. It's nice to join you this evening. One of the rare advantages of this weird situation we're in is that you can virtually join all sorts of local Green meetings by Zoom. And I always traveled the country quite a lot to come to local meetings, but it's a lot easier this way, and I'm actually seeing many more local Green parties, which is actually a real pleasure. So it's nice to be with you this evening. And as you said in your introduction, Gary, this is a topic which is gaining a lot of political traction right now, but I think we are still the sort of guardians of the holy grail of UBI. And I'm going to explain exactly what Greens mean by this proposal and why it's at the heart of our approach to the economy rather than welfare. Quite a lot of people now see this as a welfare proposal, but to us, that's not what it's about. It's a much deeper proposal than that. And I'm going to try and explain why that's the case. So firstly, why is there so much interest in UBI right now? Well, we have had a lot of success, I would say, in proposing this as a solution to the lack of basic financial security that's come along with COVID. And I, frankly, was pretty amazed when the Chancellor proposed furlough. It was an extraordinarily generous scheme for a Conservative Chancellor. And obviously, there's lots of reasons why he did that that are nothing to do with why we might have done that. But nonetheless, it was a generous offer, 80% of wages to people who were in employment. But of course, a lot of people were left out of that scheme. People who had moved into jobs at the wrong time, people who were self-employed, people who had 0 hours contracts. And in fact, the people who are in the most vulnerable employment situations did not get protection through the furlough scheme. And so it was fairly easy for us to come in and say, look, there's a really simple way of doing this. You just give everybody a basic income and you don't ask questions. You don't go through the complexity of a universal credit application. You don't do any means testing. You just give people that money. And obviously, from an economic point of view, the biggest problem we've got now is what an economist would call failure of demand. In other words, people either have got less money to spend or they're fearful, so they're hoarding their money, they're saving it rather than spending it. And every time that happens, it kind of knocks on to something else that isn't happening. And this process in itself will destroy jobs. And so what the government has to do now is get money out there and get us spending it in and direct it in the right direction. And we know that when you give money to people who have less money, they're much more likely to spend it rather than wealthy people who hold on to their money. And actually, so poorer people are much better at keeping the economy going than richer people. And there's many, many reasons why in this particular context, sending money out into the economy through a universal basic income would make a lot of sense. And I think the other thing to say is it's really a time to try different things. It's quite obvious that enormous amounts of money are being spent, and to be honest, enormous amounts of money are being wasted. The 12 billion that went to the privatized testing and tracing system, which could have been done for a fraction of the cost and far more effectively by local public health teams. You know, it's just an example of money being sent down the drain effectively. So much more useful to send that money in the direction of a really constructive policy like universal basic income. And that would have really underpinned the lives and security of everybody in the country. And it would have helped to build that solidarity and that sense that we really are all in it together. And that's one of the key principles of a benefit like UBI, because of the universal principle. The universal basic income really reminds us that we're part of a shared society and a shared economy. And I think the people that have slipped through the net of the Chancellor's various complex schemes are the best argument we've got at the moment for why a universal basic income is the best policy to follow. But that's kind of like the immediate crisis we're in. And we're actually in a much larger and wider restructuring of the economy. And we've been, again, arguing this point for quite a long time, that we need to have a much different and more flexible relationship with the labour market, because automation is coming. People say big data and artificial intelligence. It's not really artificial intelligence. It's just computers that can do things much better than we can. And my kids all work in the public sector, and my middle one is a doctor, and he's a radiologist, actually. So he interprets X-rays and CT scans. And so I said to him one day, oh, don't worry, because obviously he spent years and spent a fortune training to do that. Don't worry, you're never going to be replaced by a machine. But he said, no, Mum, a computer can interpret an X-ray with far more precision and efficiency than a person. So, the last round of automation was blue collar jobs. This round of automation is about white collar jobs. And so I think as Greens, what we realise is that could be the pathway to a delightful future with a lot of leisure and finding our sense of meaning in more satisfying ways than sitting at a computer in an office. But in order to do that, we have to make sure that the wealth that's generated through that process of automation is captured for social good and then transferred to us through a citizen's income. And the people who are most onto this, and this isn't really surprising, are the very digital billionaires who at the moment own all that wealth. And they recognize that their business model is just destroying jobs. And so Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos and all those guys, not sure about Jeff Bezos, maybe he's not in the list. Anyway, the tech billionaires are big supporters of universal basic income because they see it as a way of not taking all their money away from them to pay for it, but the principle of making sure that people can be secure without having to have a job is a principle that we need to adopt, because with automation and with us not needing to do the jobs that people have done, we will need to have some form of basic income and a form of security. And that enables us as Greens to have that conversation about what are we really here for anyway? Because obviously this is a conversation that hasn't had enough oxygen, I would say, in the public debate. And the reason is that the main opposition party is called Labour, and to the Labour Party, they accept that relationship, the sort of, as I see it, the 19th century relationship, that you should sell your labour, that your survival should depend on you selling your labour. And their politics was all about working together to make sure that you got paid better for your labour and you had better terms and conditions at work. And that's a completely different politics from Green politics, which is about saying you should achieve your human potential. You should be able to flourish. You should play your part as part of a strong community. You should have time to have a good relationship and spend time in nature. And all those propositions that we're making really, again, can be supported, I think, by the idea that you will receive an income regardless of whether you go to work. You're not put here on earth to be a worker. You're put here on earth to flourish as a human being. And the basic income can support you in doing that. So, so we have seen political progress and greater and wider political support for the UBI proposal. So there was a parliamentary early day motion back in the spring, which was supported by nearly 100 MPs. And we've since seen the Liberal Democrats come out formally now to support basic income. I'm not sure about these local motions. That will be interesting to hear more about that. I know that because I spoke to Cardiff Green Party last night, and I know that the Assembly there has passed a motion in favour of basic income. And now quite a lot of Labour MPs are also supporting. Incidentally, this has never been a particularly left or right proposal. You may have seen last week Sam Britton died, who for a long time was the editor of the FT, and he was a big supporter of citizens' income because he also saw that you needed to have this kind of different relationship with the labour market and a freedom to make your choices about the labour market that weren't dictated by your fear of destitution. So it's an interesting proposal that can cut across right and left, I would say. But traditionally, both Labour and the Tories have resisted this policy. And that's because, again, looking back to the 19th century, they are effectively the two sides of the labour market. They're the sort of Labour side and the capitalist side. And they have accepted that that's the relationship and that's the central focus in the economy. And we don't accept that. As Greens, we make claims on assets. We say we should have a right to have access to land to grow food, and we should have a right to have access to a share of the commonwealth of this nation. And that's how we frame universal basic income. And the conversation we were having last night was really interesting because obviously we want to get our first member of the Senedd, the Welsh Parliament. We've never had anybody in there, and their campaign is to get somebody elected next spring. And what Anthony Slaughter was saying, the leader of the Wales Green Party, was that we really need a Green in the room when citizens' income or basic income is being discussed, because at the moment, what they suggested in the Welsh Parliament was that they would provide this to unemployed steelworkers, so that again they're framing it as a welfare benefit, whereas we would say, there's a lot of wealth in this country. Let's tax the rich and pay everybody an income. So it's much more about redistribution and making a claim on the wealth of this country rather than being some form of welfare payment. And that's a framing. I think as people pick up this policy, we don't want that to be lost. We don't want it to just turn into a better version of universal credit, which I'm afraid both Labour and the Conservatives might be inclined to do. And I think the risk there is that we just get stuck in that old argument about whether people have a right to, about basically what your rights are as a citizen. And I really despise that distinction that's made between strivers and skivers, and that stigmatisation of people who claim welfare benefits, which I'm very sad to say Labour fell into before the Jeremy Corbyn years, and is likely to fall back into now because it's their way of getting back those sort of northern red wall voters, they think. And it's such a misguided way of looking at society. And the really interesting thing is, nobody said when furlough came in, oh, you're obviously a skiver rather than a striver because you accepted furlough from the government. And nobody says to people who've retired and are claiming a pension, oh, you're a skiver. It's a completely invidious distinction. And it's designed to stigmatise welfare and to put people off claiming welfare benefits when we know that many people need those benefits because they can't work, they're disabled, they can't find a job, whatever it is. And the thing is with universal basic income, it cuts across all of that because it says you have a right to this payment. It's your right as a citizen. It's not something you get because you've failed or you've done something wrong. It's a universal right. And to me, that's the sort of real value and benefit of this particular proposal. And at the moment, as I said, Labour are still only supporting it in a form of conditionality. So unemployed people can have a universal basic income, which completely misses the point. And as we'll see later, when I get on to talk about some of the countries that have introduced this policy, again, it's very often made conditional, whereas the Green policy is unconditional. It's your right to a share of the national wealth. So just a little bit more detail on what our proposal actually is now. It's that basically you will get a payment, and at the moment we're saying £89 per week. And that would mean, and it would be set up in such a way that nobody ended up with less money, and pensioners would receive more. So the adult rate for pensioners will be £178, and disabled people and lone parents and lone pensioners would receive a higher rate. And so the idea is not that you'll be rolling in cash, because people of working age who are able to work would still be expected to work, but it would mean that your relationship with the labour market was quite changed, because you would have this basic payment and it would enable you to actually decide how much you wanted to work and decide whether you wanted to work all the time, or would give you more choice, I think, about what jobs you would accept and what you wouldn't feel forced into employment because the alternative was destitution. And also, of course, for various groups of people, it would enable you to take time out from the labour market. You might want to, learn to become a novelist, or learn to play the guitar, or spend some time going to university. And the basic income could support you to develop your life, to really take time out of the labour market, to expand your horizons and develop your potential. And I think that, again, enables people to get off the awful treadmill of the capitalist work system, which just means so many people waste their potential and never find their real way in life. And so that's what the proposal is all about, really. It's also important to say that if you receive housing benefit, you will continue to receive that while you were receiving universal basic income. And so the idea would be that it was enough to support your basic needs, but it's not, it's not riches by any means. And of course, it would also replace all the other benefits and payments that are going out. And that would be efficient and would save a lot of money in administration. But it would also remove all that ignominy and, lack of dignity around having to claim benefits, and just the time wasted and the humiliation that people have to go through. And very often, I think that is one of the reasons people find it so hard to actually get employment if they're unemployed, is that they're constantly under that pressure, and it's just undermining people's self-confidence. And also they fear coming off universal credit because it takes so long to get your benefits back that it's safer to just stay where you are. But this would take the risk out of maybe just working a little bit, or taking those first steps back into the labour market. So yeah, I think I've already gone through the key principles, but just to reiterate philosophically why we think this is a good policy. We think that financial security is a key building block of a good society, and that people who are insecure and fearful cannot be such good cooperative citizens. And so building a good society means guaranteeing to everybody that basic financial security. And we're also guaranteeing that nobody who's currently receiving benefits will be worse off under our form of universal basic income. And many, many people would be a lot better off financially. And everybody, I believe, would be better off psychologically. So the universal principle is very important, as I've said. The idea of your share of the Commonwealth is also very important. And lastly, and I say this quite unashamedly as an aging hippie now, it just gives you the capacity to let us flourish as human beings and let the human spirit flourish. And I feel really proud of the fact that as Greens, that's what we're about. It's not about getting by or getting on or doing better than the next person. It's about being the person you should be. And a society and a community should enable that. And universal basic income is one of the building blocks, I believe, that would enable that and just take away this sort of the grinding misery of so many people's lives in this country today. So just to finish, I wanted to mention a few examples where something like a basic income has already been introduced. It's interesting that some of the poorer countries of the world are actually making more progress here than countries that have a lot more money available to fund such a scheme. And one example that I think is very impressive is the Bolsa Familia that was introduced under Lula's government in Brazil about 15 years ago. And it's a payment for small families in the favelas. It's not exactly universal basic income because it is conditional. It's paid to poor families and to single mums on condition that they make sure their children go to school. And so it has that condition on it. So it doesn't have that universal unconditional quality. But I think it has a similar incentive in that it wants to underpin families' subsistence and their security, so that they don't send their children out to beg, and so that, you know, they can make sure their children are actually fulfilling their potential. Then in Portugal, they've recently introduced a minimum income scheme. This is not universal basic income because it is means tested, but again it's conditional on going to school. But it's a similar kind of guarantee of a minimum income at least. And then a more interesting example is one introduced recently as a result of COVID by the Spanish government. And in May this year, they launched a monthly basic income scheme for the most vulnerable households, which had been hit by the coronavirus crisis. And they're aiming to reach 100,000 households initially, which will be the poorest and single parent households. And each adult under the scheme will get a monthly payment of at least €462, which is £410. So that's not dissimilar to what we're suggesting. And, you know, for a country that's quite a lot poorer than we are, I think that's an impressive policy. And the plan is to just begin with those families, but eventually build out to reach 1 million homes. So it's not, again, universal, but it's on a much wider scale than the sort of proposals that I've been discussing previously. Now, the only genuine national citizens' income scheme in the whole world is in Alaska, and it's called the Permanent Fund of Alaska. And it essentially provides everybody with a share of the oil wealth that's produced in that US state. So you probably know that when Norway discovered oil in the North Sea, they put a lot of the money that came from that into a state wealth fund. And that money is now invested in paying the pensions of Norwegian people. But in this country, it was given to, the concessions were given to Shell and other private companies, and they took the profits. And so we don't have a nice little pot of gold there now to fund us all through our old age. But in Alaska, they did a different thing, which is to say, there's a lot of wealth from our state here, and we're going to make sure that some of it is paid out as a share to every Alaska citizen. So again, it's not a huge amount, and it's not a fixed amount either, because it depends how much money is being made from oil. And obviously, again, for us, that's an industry with a limited future. But I think as a principle, it is the principle of everybody having a share of the Commonwealth. And I think that's a key principle that guides our policy of UBI. So it's so for that reason, it's a good example. And finally, you may have heard about the pilot study that was run recently in Finland, and it was a 2-year study. It was quite an interesting example because it was run by people who were hostile to the idea, and they wanted to sort of try it out, and so because they were under some political pressure. And what they were checking was whether people had their commitment to going to work undermined. And that's often an argument you hear against universal basic income. Oh, you know, people will never go to work again. And so they ran the pilot scheme to test out in a small community. They gave a universal basic income to unemployed people to see whether that disincentivized them continuing to work. And at the end of 2 years, they had some, I think, not unsurprising results, but, you know, the sort of mainstream people were quite surprised. But what they found was that being in receipt of universal basic income meant that people obviously enjoyed greater financial security, and they enjoyed more secure mental health. They were happier, basically, because they weren't worrying about money. And they also found, again, something that doesn't surprise me, but did surprise the researchers, that there was no disincentive to work. People were just as likely to work if they received this payment as not, but, you know, they could have a different relationship with the labour market if they chose to. And in fact, they found that without the fear of losing benefits, people were able to take more flexible and more insecure employment opportunities. And I think, you know, I've made lots of arguments for UBI, which will go down well with the Green audience and might not go down so well with the bus driver or, you know, the person you meet in the shop or wherever you can go to these days. But I think this argument is a really powerful one, that unemployment is becoming a lot more insecure anyway. And what we're saying with this policy is we want to give people a basic underpinning, because we don't want them to be left to the vagaries of 0 hours contracts and really poor employment contracts. And so universal basic income is really important right now because of this insecure relationship to the labour market that's only going to increase, but also, of course, immediately because of people's need to have a basic income to survive the ravages of COVID. So that's all I had to say. I look forward to hearing your thoughts and questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Molly. Yes, indeed, we come to questions. Can I just explain before we ask our questions the technicalities? If you wish to ask a question, could you please use the raise your hand facility? To do that, you have to click on participants and click on the button labelled raise hand. So click on participants and then click on the button labelled raise hand. Evelyn and I will be able to see then that you wish to ask a question. And when we ask you to ask your question, if you please unmute yourself, just give your name and your Green Party, which Green Party you come from if you are a Green Party member, and then ask your question, and then please mute yourself again. So the floor is open for your questions, please.
So, Gary, the first person who wants to ask a question is Patrick.
Patrick.
Hello, Patrick. I'm from Stockport Green Party. I just heard a politician discussing this idea and dismissing it in one sentence. He just said it's too expensive, it's ridiculous. So I'm sorry, Molly, but could you do you know how much it will cost and where the money will come from?
I haven't got the costings with me today. There are various costed proposals. There's a recent book called Toppling Nine Giants, I think it is, by Guy Standing, and he has a costed proposal. And when people want to be dismissive and say it's impossible to afford it, they usually do that by not having any net, so they just take the cost I've talked about and they multiply that by everybody in the country and they say that's an enormous amount of money. To be honest, even if we did that, it wouldn't be as much money as the government is shelling out in furlough, because it's a lower amount than was suggested, because that was up to, I think, £2,400 a month. So on a monthly basis, it would be cheaper to pay for this than it is to pay for the furlough. But the point is that a lot of people are already in receipt of some form of benefits and they wouldn't get this in addition. So, maybe 20% of people are getting the pension, and that would then net off against the citizen's income. And then for people who were in employment, once they reach the tax-free level, effectively the money that they're not having to pay in tax, again, will be netted off against citizens' income. So although I'm proposing it as a universal benefit, and it is a universal benefit, you would no longer receive the benefit of not having to pay tax. So when you went to work, you would pay tax immediately. You wouldn't get that tax-free allowance. So once you take into account all those adjustments to the benefit system, not to mention the massive amount of money wasted through pointless administration of UBI, then it becomes a much more manageable amount of money. And I'm sorry, I haven't got the costings here with me, but okay. There's various... There's various different ways of costing it. There's various different proposals that have been made. Maybe I should look through and send you them tomorrow. But there's one by Malcolm Totty, for example, and there's also that one by Guy Standing. And people that want to dismiss it just make an enormous sum. But obviously it's part of a system where there will be adjustments to other benefits, and an awful lot of people already in receipt of one benefit or another. And then once you've narrowed it down in that way, then what we're aiming to do is tax rich people the value that they get and share it with poorer people. So I don't think there's any need to be defensive about that at all. We live in an incredibly unequal society and an increasingly unequal society. And as the spirit level research showed a few years ago, that's actually bad for all of us. Everybody in more equal societies is happier. So taxing and giving some of that money to everybody as their share of the national wealth would lead to a community with more solidarity and a happier society, less crime, less unwanted pregnancies. Just every single statistic was improved in more equal societies.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's an easy way of dismissing it, isn't it? Saying it's going to cost £5 trillion a year or whatever, but then they don't look at the other side.
I don't think anybody would say that much, but right now that, I mean, I'm the person that wants a comprehensive spending review this autumn, because I want to see what the government's spending £12 billion on. I mean, I want the government to be accountable for the money they're spending. So I think right now, anybody who'd have the brass neck, at least a Tory, to make that argument, should be slapped down, because they're the people that are wasting money, far more money than we're suggesting spending here. And of course, the other thing is, it's that awful kind of handbag economics view, isn't it? Which is like, there's a limited amount of money, you take it out and it's gone, which is, as I tried to explain at the beginning, completely wrong. This is about recirculating money. And what we need to, our biggest problem now is not having enough money. It's the government not spending money and the rich hoarding their money and everybody pulling in their horns simultaneously. And that just pushes us into a downward spiral. And we've been living in that since the financial crisis. And COVID is just the next part of that. And so what we propose as Greens is push the money out there, get people spending it to stop us falling off a cliff edge recession. And obviously, we're not just saying do that in a random way. We're saying invest in the Green New Deal, invest in those green jobs, pay publicly to have people's homes retrofitted. So somebody who's lost a job because of COVID can then have a new job retrofitting somebody's home, but right now, I mean, this argument won't be good forever, but right now we need the government to be investing big scale, because the biggest crisis we're facing is a massive recession. Every country, but countries that invest, in the future will prevent that from happening. A country that starts thinking about austerity will just make the economic situation so much worse.
Thank you, Patrick. Evelyn, who was second to put their hand up?
Gina Dowding. Got a question from Gina.
Gina, I didn't see you there.
Hello, Molly. Hi, nice to see you.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. So, so just following from Patrick and the kind of things that people slap you down with, what, in terms of phasing this in, Molly, like people are saying we could start with this, and I think the motions that are going around, and we're thinking of submitting one, somebody's drafted one for Lancaster City Council, is about, we want to be a pilot. But presumably, if you're a pilot area, it's not for everybody. There's a cutoff. You target it at the beginning at those people most vulnerable, or how? It's really the question. Like, what is your suggestions for a trial
to be honest with you, I'm not a great fan of pilot schemes, as I said in the case of Finland, because it would just create distortions between different labour markets. I would see it much more like when Gordon Brown introduced tax credits. That was a vast amount of additional spending. It completely transformed people's relationship with the labour market. It brought probably 1 million children out of poverty, and it was just planned in the Treasury and then introduced. It's coming in 2 years' time. Oh, there we are, it's come in. And that's how I would do it. I wouldn't start with a pilot scheme. I don't know about these local motions. I mean, I can't really see how they're going to work. In Wales, they could do that if they could find the money. But I don't know how you could do that in a part of England. So, I'm thinking about it coming from the Treasury, being done top down and being done everywhere, and really being a revolution in how we run the benefit system, the tax and benefit system, actually. So more like tax credits, which were not really tax credits. They were payments to poorer people. Quite similar to this, but this would be more radical because you wouldn't have to have children in order to receive it. But to me, that's the way to do it, not start piecemeal, but just make the proposal and go for it. And that was actually what we were proposing in the general election. But anyway, tell me more about what's happening in Lancaster. I'm interested to hear.
Well, we are submitting a motion that I think Jamie Osborne in Norwich has done something, and is So I think it's sort of supporting the idea, and I don't know whether it's actually saying we want to be a pilot, but we like, basically saying we like this idea. But is there a way that, just in terms of, the government's so unlikely to do it totally our way, get it right, you know, is there a way that you could say, well, anybody, this could apply in the first instance to anybody currently on 30k or less a year, or you know, average income?
I don't think you'd need to do that because of the point about it netting off against tax-free allowance. There wouldn't really be any advantage financially in doing that. But I mean, I think really what we're doing here is we're basically stuck with this absolutely appalling government that most people didn't vote for until 2024, aren't we? But as I see it, what we're doing is preparing the ground with much more radical ideas for the future. And to me, it makes more sense to do that. So everybody that's everybody that's out there thinks, yeah, citizens' income's a great idea, or universal basic income's a great idea. And then it goes into all the manifestos, let's say, of the alternative parties, or just our manifesto, and we make the case for people to vote for us on the basis of that next time. I must admit, I've given up any hope for this government until you know, because they're just going to do all the wrong things. So to me, the priority is making sure that we get the right government next time. And that's about radicalizing people, getting these radical ideas out there, and then kind of playing hardball with Labour about, you know, a deal at the next election, and making sure that we change the voting system. Because I think things have got so bad. We need to give people these radical ideas and these hopes for what the future could look like if they had a proper government. And that government is not just a Labour government, it's a pluralist government. So that's my track anyway. I think individual motions from councils supporting this are great because they make all the councillors think about it then. Yeah. And they all understand it then. But like I was saying about Anthony Slaughter last night, it's really important that people get that green version of it, not the, oh, this might help some poor people over there, but this is like our right, it's our share of the Commonwealth. That's a kind of radical tradition that we carry as Greens, going right back to, you know, kind of the levellers and through the Civil War and all of that. And we have to stand up for that view of the economy. So if the motion goes in and, you know, you make that speech, some Labour person will probably say, oh, yes, that'll be good when people lose their jobs. But, you know, it's our chance, that motion, to make the kind of defence of UBI that I've made tonight. Because to me, it's that vision of the economy belonging to all of us, rather than us having to sort of scrabble around in a horrible job to get a part of it back, is our really radical vision that is far more appealing, I think, than Labour's rather tame vision of.
Is our next question.
Sorry, everybody froze for me just then, and it just came up and said my internet connection was unstable. But anyway, you're all back again now. So sorry about that. So next question is Judy Fillmore. Judy?
Thank you. Yes, I'm here. Yeah. I'm from Alveston Green Party. I used to live in Stockport, so I used to be in Stockport Green Party, just to say that little bit. Okay, my question is really about the name. Universal Basic Income does seem to capture what it's about, but it's also, I think, very confusing for people and gets very mixed up with universal credit. So I'd just like to talk a little bit about that, whether there was any thought of changing the name or whether people feel that it does actually capture what it's about.
I think it is descriptive of what it's about because, as I've kept stressing, the universality, the universal principle is really important. I don't particularly like the word basic, although it is, I would say, descriptive because we're not talking about a vast amount of money here. But you've probably heard me slip into sometimes calling it citizens' income because when I first knew the policy, it was called citizens' income. And I still think that's a better name for it because to me, that sums up that it's kind of your right as a citizen. It's income due to you as a citizen. So I've always preferred that name. But we had that name in our policy and then suddenly everybody else was talking about universal basic income and that was taking off. And so then we changed our policy to reflect, the wider support for UBI. But like you, I don't think it's the best name, but I don't think we're going to be able to control that now. So I think we're going to have to stick with it.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, Judy.
Okay, so the next person with the question is Phoebe Spence.
Hi, hello.
Hi.
Thank you very much, Molly. I was interested that some of the places it's been put into effect, it was about schooling or a service. So I want to understand a bit more what you think about universal basic services, how that would complement or work with an income, because we all need services. And just a sort of supplementary question is, how are the trade unions responding to universal basic income?
Yeah, well, I would really like to hear a bit more about, from you or from others about where this universal basic services idea has come from, because my view is it's a sort of rhetorical flourish coming from Labour people who don't like the policy for the reasons I explained previously. And so when you say universal basic income, they come back and say, what I really want is universal basic services. But I don't want basic services. I want really excellent top quality services. And I think that's a different part of our policy where we are offering that, because we're offering to increase taxes to pay for schools and hospitals to be really excellent. So I mean, universal basic services is much worse than universal basic income, because we want really excellent services. So to me, that's a slogan and it doesn't work at all. But I'd love to hear more about the content of that, because I may be getting that wrong. But where the unions are on this is, I think they're holding Labour back from taking a more radical position, because it's the nature of being a trade union that your power arises from people's labour and people being in work and in organised work. Now, I'm a big supporter of trade unions, and I think everybody should join a trade union. And I wish trade unions could organise more effectively in the sort of precarious work that a lot of people have at the moment. And I know they try to do that, and it's very difficult for them. But I don't think, but to me, that's about improving the quality and conditions of your life in enforced labour. And I think that the universal basic income would empower you as a worker in a different kind of way. So being in a union would still be important to negotiate good terms and conditions in your job, but universal basic income would give you the chance to say, actually, I won't do that job unless you pay me better or give me these better conditions. And it especially would empower people in a different kind of way to not have to take really crap jobs and precarious jobs. So I do feel, I don't know any of the unions that do support this, and I can see exactly why they wouldn't. And yeah, it's an interesting dilemma, really. But again, you tell me more, and especially about universal basic services and what that actually means in practice.
Well, my main reading about it is by Anna Coote at the New Economics Foundation. So yeah, what sort of services we would expect. So it could be like utilities and so on. I think personally, I mean, I've just noticed how individual and consumerist the general approach can be, like PIPs and so on. So everybody is having to act as an employer, when really you'd like a good, excellent, whatever superlative, caring service. I mean, I'm interested in the caring economy. There's a lot of, the economy needs a real change, but I'm saying services are part of it as well as income.
Yeah, well, I don't think we should have to make that argument. I think we made that argument decades ago that we had a right to not only National Health Service, but also excellent quality schools and publicly provided care in old age. And that's all been central to the Green Party. That doesn't really cut across this proposal, I don't think. But I think there's an interesting, maybe the proposal for universal basic services also extends to things like internet and electricity and so on, and saying that you shouldn't have to pay for those. And that is, or even housing. And that, I think, I mean, we haven't gone that far as the Green Party. But I really question the idea of housing in a market, you know, because if it's something that you need fundamentally to survive, then yeah, it should be provided publicly and not through a market system, I would say. So maybe that's what the proposal means, but it's rather a strange kind of name, I would say. And it feels like they've sort of extended on from universal basic income, which I think, although I don't like the name, I think it is descriptive of what it is. But universal basic services, I don't think is descriptive. Like I said, you know, we used to argue for really good services, and we still do. And I think both Labour and the Greens, although we are more resistant to privatisation than Labour have been traditionally, and maybe will be under Keir Starmer, but you know, we certainly support high taxes to pay for good public services.
Thank you for raising that, Phoebe. Who's next? Evelyn, please.
Stephanie Wyatt.
Stephanie.
Hello. I was really interested to hear about kind of the philosophical side of UBI, and obviously many of us may have taken the time to actually stop and think about what our purpose in life. We're investing our time in politics, things like that. But I just wondered if you had any suggested kind of perspectives to take on when kind of trying to explain universal basic income to somebody who is morally based on their Labour value. So somebody who takes pride in Labour, how do you then remove that, what is fundamentally part of themselves?
I think this is a challenge. I don't think it's especially a challenge for us in selling the UBI. It's a challenge that we're facing as a society and will continue to face. And I did my PhD research in the South Wales valleys after the end of mining with a lot of men who not only absolutely believed in the dignity of their employment, but were defending dangerous jobs where lots of people died because they felt the human value and the spiritual value almost of doing that work. And now they were sort of condemned to working in horrible factories wearing paper hats, you know, and they absolutely hated that. And I totally understood that. But I don't think this is, I mean, I don't think we should defend those jobs, obviously not in coal mining and not a lot of the heavy industry jobs. But you can see why people were socialized in that way, because they had to go down the pit to survive and people were needed to go down the pit. So the compensation for that was making them feel they were really heroic and important and dignified, which indeed they were, you know, and they kept our whole economy going for 100 years. And lots of my relatives were miners. But I feel this is in a way, UBI is a way into that important discussion about what is our relationship with the labour market now and how does that connect to our identity? And that's the question I was asking in my PhD. And the conclusion I came to is that we need to substitute different identities because employment identities have been eroded. And firstly, I don't think we can stop that. And secondly, I don't think we should want to stop that because actually, a lot of people's experience of employment is that it's denigrating and dangerous and shortens their lives. So why would we, and limits their lives. So why would we encourage people to do that? But that, you know, so as Greens, a lot of us get our sense of satisfaction and fulfillment in doing Green Party politics or building our communities or working on the community allotment or working on the community, you know, we have other ways of building our identities. And I think that's us kind of leading the trend in a way. But I absolutely take on board that there's a huge amount of readjustment of social and cultural priorities needed here. And also, this is a similar sort of intellectual shift that we need to make in terms of the green transition, because the inclination of a lot of traditional workers and their organisations is to defend the jobs that they've always done. And we have to make a rapid shift towards different kinds of employment. I mean, I don't think retrofitting somebody's house is any less dignified than being an air steward, but maybe other people would. But you know, so I think there's a big job cultural shift coming there, and hopefully bringing UBI in can help to have that conversation. But I agree, it's not an easy one to convince people of.
Thank you, Stephanie.
So the next person or people who want to ask a question, we've got Maggie and John.
Maggie and John, please.
It's John Pearson here. Maggie's not with me at the moment. It's our standard Monica
We'll
for
imagine her. It's okay.
our Zoom. Yeah, I'm not a Green Party member. I'm a member of Stockport Socialist Discussion Group. I'm very grateful for the invitation to join the discussion tonight. I want to ask for some clarification about what you said, Molly, about UBI in the Green Party proposal replacing benefits other than housing benefit. Do you mean it would also replace the state pension, for one? Because I heard you give a figure for pensioners for UBI of 108. Well, my state pension at the moment is £156 a week. So, if it's going to be replaced by 108, does that mean that the Green Party considers that the 156 a week I get is excessive? The other example I would give, if I can, is from Universal Credit, where currently a person who does a work capability assessment and is assessed as having limited capability for work-related activity gets an additional £80 a week on top of the standard allowance, which until next March, when Rishi Sunak's going to cut it again, is £94 a week. So that's 174. Again, I mean, are you saying that that is excessive? And for anybody, you did say nobody would be worse off. That's like personal protection. But for anybody in identical circumstances, in years to come, they're going to receive less. It's a bit like students no longer getting free grants, isn't it? When those of us who went through our education in the 70s did. Personal protection isn't any compensation for saying that we're going to take a step backwards, and some people in identical circumstances will be worse off than their predecessors.
No, so the proposal that we put down for the general election, a lot of work went into it to examine all those cases. And so the figure for pension is 189, not 108, it's 189. And indeed, all the disability was all calculated so that people would receive the additional payments and the additional housing payments and so on. But it would replace universal credit. So it would be the main payment people got who were currently receiving the basic payment because they didn't have any employment. But the difference would be that they wouldn't have it taken away if they then found even a small amount of employment. So that's why it would remove the benefit trap for unemployed people. If they didn't do any work, then they would only be marginally better off, but they would have the possibility then to go and earn additional money without losing this benefit. But for everybody else, it would be a higher rate than they were presently earned. And it's not about individual circumstances. It would then be about uprating the benefits, every year in line. So so the guarantee that people wouldn't be worse off isn't like a guarantee for one person now. It's a general guarantee that nobody would be worse off. But I think the rates of disability benefit, again, really need to be investigated. And that is why we made that commitment that nobody would be worse off, because it's actually, although it's a simple payment compared to universal credit, it is quite complex when you look at individual circumstances. But I would also say that for people, for example, who are now not able to work because they have, stress-related disability, so they can't carry out a very stressful job or a full-time job. I think for people like that, it might, not that they will be compelled to go to work, but if they had that universal basic income, they might then feel they could do some hours of work on top, and that would help to bring them back into society rather than having to then stay permanently on disability. So again, I think it could underpin different improvements in life for people on disability. But no, I can absolutely guarantee to you, because the previous version did have a very tiny number of people who ended up worse off. So that was all sorted out before the last election, because we did get criticised for some sorts of disabled people on very high disability payments would have been worse off under the previous version, but that was all reworked to make sure that didn't happen.
Thank you, John. Evelyn, who is questioner number 7, please?
So the next person is Ian Brown.
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you for your talk. It was most interesting. I learned a few things. But about 2 years ago, I went to a discussion on universal basic income, and in preparation, I made a sort of an essay of my ideas on it. And one of the things that struck me was if you pay everyone a universal basic income, to those in work, you know, people have a decent job, it would actually widen their poverty gap to a certain extent. So what the suggestion I put forward was that those people who are in work with reason, you know, rather reasonable paying jobs, they should get paid the universal basic income, but then it should be taken back as is and paid over as national insurance payments are made, which would keep the balance of you know, of the income gap. And also, if somebody who was wanted to work part-time, you could take, say, 10% of the basic income, pay 10% of the basic income back for every half day worked. Because I think, you know, if you're going to give, I would have also suggested a higher universal basic income. Obviously not too high to discourage people to go into work, but high enough so as they could live off it. But if then they have a decent paying job, they would pay it back while they have that job. If they lost the job, they would still be receiving the universal basic income. I don't know what you think of that, because you know, I just think that, you know, you want to try and keep people on a more even level rather than paying people in jobs 5,000 a year extra or whatever it happens to be. It'll actually, and the people who are out of jobs are still only getting that 5,000. So it makes a big disparity in the the income of people. You know, it unlevels the playing field.
Yeah, I think actually that is what the proposal is. So all insurance is a bit of a fake thing. It basically, you know, people think it pays for the health service, but it doesn't anymore. So we would have unified just one tax. You would be paid on your income from dividends and your income from work through a single tax system, and this would also help, you know, get rid of all the capital gains avoidance scams and so on. But essentially, yes, if you were earning more, you would then pay more in tax to compensate. But also we would have a more progressive tax system generally, so that we could pay for better public services. So we're not really worrying about the people at the upper end of the scale here. You know, they're earning far too much. The basic income would be irrelevant to them, but they would then be paying a lot more in tax. So, you know, once you got above, what, there was a number here, I think it was 50,000. Once you got above that, you would start losing through our tax system to compensate for the basic income. But the other thing to say is, we're all speculating now what the consequences would be for people's attachment to the labour market, and, you know, whether they try and put money offshore, or whether they'd, you know, people will, there's always unforeseen consequences with a change in policy, is what I'm trying to say. For example, with working families tax credit, it was so much money that a lot of people pretended to work for 30 hours and just lived on the tax credit. I mean, I had friends doing that. So when you introduce a change like this, we're all speculating about what the responses would be, and we don't really know. And that's why the pilot study in Finland's interesting, because it tells you that people don't decide not to go to work. And that was quite a lot higher than the level we're proposing, actually. But, you know, I think the point is nobody's ever really done this. So the first country that does it is going to learn things and then adjust. And I think it would just be nice if that was us, but probably not with this government, probably be one of the Scandinavian countries. But then we'll find out whether you're right or not. And then, you know, we'd adjust the policy to address any anomalies.
Yeah. Well, I'm all in favour of a universal basic. In fact, I've been for quite a while. And one of the things it would save is a lot of faffing about with all these little benefits and what have you.
Yeah.
You just pay pay them all the money, and you wouldn't have to. It's to save a lot of bureaucratic work, I suppose.
Yeah.
Being that the bureaucrats will have to go on to universal basic income.
Yeah. No, definitely. I mean, there's a lot of exactly pointless bureaucratic work, but it's also humiliating means testing. It will get rid of all that as well. And that, I think, would liberate people on both sides of that equation, because there's people in crap jobs in crap bureaucratic jobs administering systems, humiliating people who, don't want to be having to say all this detail in order to get the benefit. So all of that would be swept away, and that would in itself save a lot of money.
And if somebody became unemployed, they would have more time to spend looking for a decent job, and they wouldn't have to be constantly going to the whatever they call the labour exchange nowadays. They wouldn't have to keep going to the labour exchange or whatever to sign on and all this sort of thing. It'd save an awful. It'd make life
exactly. That's all part of the ritual humiliation, though, isn't it? Having to prove that you've applied for 200 jobs that you didn't get. So now your confidence is cast down. You're much less likely to find a job. Plus, you're feeling more stressed and depressed. And yeah, all of that nightmare will be swept away.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Who's next, Evelyn?
So we've got a question actually in the chat from Nikki, and I think it's Nikki Lancaster. I know she's from Lancaster Greens, but she'd like me to ask this question for her, and she says there is a conspiracy theory going around that is that UBI will be used to make people conform and will be stopped if people don't conform. And also, would it be linked to ID cards?
It's the opposite of that, really, isn't it? As we were just discussing, the current benefit system forces you to conform. This would be completely unconditional, and therefore there couldn't be any way of making you conform to anything. I've always really opposed ID cards, and I think it's going to be difficult getting through this next migration system that they're introducing without ID cards, actually, because I think we're all going to have to prove who we are to prove we're not sort of like illegal immigrants. But anyway, I will resist that to the hilt. I mean, yeah, it's a British thing, isn't it, not to like ID cards? And I really don't. And having lived in Belgium as an MEP, it made me very weird, because I would go down to the local police station and they literally had a database, and they had, like, the flat I was living in was empty because everybody else had registered because they were all European, and they just thought that was completely normal, that the local police station knew where everybody lived and quite a lot of stuff about them, except me, because I'm English and I just didn't, because I didn't want anybody knowing anything about me. But I tell you what, that is a very English or British thing. So you wouldn't need an ID card. You would need a national insurance number, though. But, we all have one of those, don't we? The national insurance number is the only identifier that we have in this country, other than your address and I suppose your mobile phone number. But that makes us very unusual. But a national insurance number would be enough to pay universal basic income. So there's no need to change anything in order to make the payments.
Okay, thanks, Molly. So the next person who has a question is Daniel Jerome.
Hello, everybody. I'm Dan Jerome from Trafford Green Party. And this question is probably economically illiterate, so sorry if it's a stupid question. But I was just wondering, when there's an economic downturn, could you raise the amount of universal income, basic income? And when the economy goes into, positive place, could you reduce it? Is it something you could link to the kind of success of the economy? In a way of, when we have a massive downturn, it'd be a good way of pumping money into the economy to get people spending. Would that work at all? Thank you.
That's not a daft question. That's a very sensible question, I would say. But of course, it's sort of counterintuitive, because it's when the economy is doing well, you've got the money to give to people, right? And when the economy is doing badly, you get less. Like now, not only have we got massive costs, we've also got huge loss of tax revenue, and so we've got, the Treasury has far less money than it would usually have at a time when there's far greater costs. But your question is basically a Keynesian question, and I think the right question. And the answer should be, now is the time for the government to tax the money that the wealthy hold in assets and push that back into the economy. So from a theoretical economics point of view, I think you're absolutely right. And that's why now would be a very good time to introduce the citizens' income. And that's exactly why the Australian government gave all their citizens $1,000 just to try and keep the economy going. And we should be doing the same, definitely. But it's harder to make the case in a way now because we're actually poorer. But it's a bootstrap problem. And that's the problem we're going to get into with the recession that's looming. And so, yes, the government, when everybody else is skint, the government becomes the sort of engine of last resort for the economy. And so that's why it would make absolute sense for them to introduce citizens' income now, even if they didn't do it forever, even if they just gave everybody £1,000 a month for a year, that could stop us falling off a cliff edge. And if you look back to 2008, when we had the financial crisis, the Labour government did exactly the right things, carried on investing, pushed money out into the economy. And the big recession came when the Tories came in and started austerity and cuts, and especially in the regional economies, because they cut the well-paid public sector jobs in local government, in health and so on. 1 million jobs lost in the public sector, and places like Stockport would have been really badly hit by that because, in the regional economies, it's the public sector where the really well-paid jobs are. So that's sucking a vast amount of money out and funneling it back down the southeast. So yes, I'm with you on the Keynesian point, but it's basically right, but it's sort of counterintuitive because it's saying you have to spend more when you've got less. But that is indeed, I would say, what we should be doing right now.
Okay, thanks. So the next question is from Diane Coffey.
Hello, Molly. It's not a question as to say I'm from the Women's Equality Party, and we love the principle of UBI because it would give women an individual income, something that mothers had with child benefit, but it was only for a certain amount of years. This would be for women in their own right. And women are the majority of unpaid carers. Quite often they've been working, but somebody in the family needs looking after, so they become voluntarily unemployed with all the implications of that for their finance. UBI would recognize women have their own right to their own income. This is something universal credit, by being paid into one bank account, took away from a lot of women. So we do like it. I won't go into all the financial implications because I'm not really an economist. It's just the general principle is good for women.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. I wish I'd made that point. I totally agree with you. And I think it is a scandal that benefits are paid to the head of household. And very often that is a male head of household, and there's absolutely no guarantee that that money's then shared fairly across the household. So it's one of the things I really value about basic income, that it's a citizen's income. That's why I like it being called a citizen's income, because it goes to men, women and children. Different rates for children, but nonetheless, children. So if you're a single mum with children, you would receive a much better income. And if you're even if you're in a relationship, the children's benefit could be paid into the mother's account. So yes, it definitely, I agree, empowers women and gives them, it treats them as equal citizens, which our benefit system doesn't.
Okay, thanks. So we have two more questions, people with their hands up. So I think that's probably as many as we can take then, Gary. We'll end it there, shall we? So we've got a question from Lindy Brett, and after that it will be Paolo Grinelli. So Lindy.
Hello everyone.
Hello Lindy, haven't seen you for ages.
Hi, Molly.
Can't see you actually, but
yeah. Treasury Green Party, so pretty near Stockport, Macclesfield. I've got two comments actually, not so much questions. The first one is a bit random. I was listening to Rory Stewart on Radio 4 last week, I think, And I think he would very much support your opposition to the division in skivers versus strivers. He was speaking very eloquently on that. Second point, more relevant really. There's lots of practical, it's just a comment, lots of practical reasons to love the basic income idea. But I've always believed that it was an entitlement, that we're all entitled to a share of the Commonwealth. And for quite a particular reason, that we're prevented from owning land, so that if we become unemployed, we can't go out and kill the pig or raise a pig. Many of us haven't got gardens big enough to grow enough vegetables to feed ourselves on. So that's just a belief I've held for a long time that I'd throw into the mix.
Yeah, nice to see you, Lindy. And I'm totally with you over that. And I think, you know, it's like going back to the time of commons when we had the right to graze cattle and keep pigs, and you know, the ending of that was the beginning of wage slavery. And it isn't a coincidence that the enclosures and the turfing of people off common land occurred at the point when capitalists started needing people in their factories. So I very much see that connection. And I think, yeah, we should make a claim on land as well. But this is like our claim on that share of the Commonwealth that really people have been struggling for, and had struggled for more effectively in a way in the Middle Ages. And they lost that control then through the 19th century and through the industrial system.
Yes, indeed.
Okay, thanks. And so final question from Paolo Grinelli.
Hello there. Hi. This might be a stupid question, I'm not sure. But I was just wondering if universal basic income is supposed to be something that reacts to kind of changeable things like, you know, rising prices in energy, or like the price of a train ticket and things like that, or is it something that absolutely has to go hand in hand with nationalisation of these kind of things, and maybe possibly like a re-education to how maybe young people look at spending their money in the future?
Well, I think it's really important to say that you can't solve all the problems with one policy. And so, like a bit like the answer to the question on universal basic services, you know, we still have to have really well-funded public transport. We still have to have really well-funded hospitals. We'll still have to tax rich people more to make sure that we have those things. But at the same time, universal basic income wouldn't be a fixed amount. You know, it would increase, as all benefits do, in response to rising increase in prices and so on, and also reflecting the greater wealth of the country. So yeah, I would say it's not a policy that solves all problems, but I think it's a policy that really does solve a lot of problems, and also it solves some of the problems that affect the poorest and most vulnerable the worst, and it helps to bring about, I believe, if we introduced it, will bring about really important cultural shifts in terms of our sense of self-esteem, our relationship to the labour market, and our sense of ourselves as a shared community and people who have a right to a share of the economic wealth of the country. So yeah, it's a big deal policy, I think, and we shouldn't allow it to be sort of shorn of all that radical potential and just turned into an alternative form of welfare payment.
Yeah, I completely agree. Thank you.
Hi, I know I said that would be the last question, but I noticed that Jin Ju from Korea, from the Korean Greens, has just put her hand up. So I would really like to take that question, please.
Hello, everyone. I'm Ju from South Korea. It's very nice to join this discussion. It's early morning here. It's going to be 5 a.m.
You're so keen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm a Green Party member of South Korea, and currently involved in the research on the pilot project of the basic income, led by the one biggest province called Gyeonggi province in South Korea, which is going to be implemented next year, I think, because we are going to complete the research within this month. So I think we have quite different political and economic situation between UK and South Korea, but we do have similar crises such as COVID-19 or the climate crisis, etc. But because we also have especially the after the COVID-19 occurred, we have actually public discourse about the basic income, because the central government provided the 3 months emergency kind of basic income. We call it basic income by some of the politicians, and others who are on the right-wing side do not want to call it basic income, so they call it the emergency assistance. But the central government actually provided a certain amount of money to all the citizens, excluding the foreigners, for 3 months, which is quite similar to the basic income, although it's a very short time. So the people started talking about the basic income actually, and this provincial government would like to introduce a pilot project of the basic income, targeting on the rural area, not the urban area. So my question is that, what do you think about the impact of pilot project in certain area or countries? And I learned the Scottish government recently did the research work on pilot project targeting 4 areas in Scottish government, and I want to know your idea how you think about this Scottish government proposal or research work. And the second question is that do you see the different understanding or meaning between of the basic income between the rural area and the urban area, not particularly in UK, maybe in general?
Yeah. Well, it sounds like you're going to be the country that does it first, which is really exciting. And I think you should write down everything you know and send it across. You know, if you can write it in English, this will be fantastic. We could send it in as part of our debate. I don't know that much about the Scottish pilots. Again, if I recall correctly, they're quite small. And the issue is in the UK that this sort of spending is still controlled by the national government. So although the government in Scotland could introduce some projects, it would really be too expensive for them to do it because they don't have control of taxation. So as I remember it, they're still quite small, more like experimental projects, whereas it sounds like yours is you know, a full-scale pilot. I mean, it will be difficult for me to make a comparison between this country and South Korea because I just don't know South Korea well enough. But I suppose one thing I could say is that the sort of opportunities that are opened up to you, a bit like what Lindy was saying, you know, that if you live in an area like where I do, then if you have your basic income paid, you can really disconnect from the labour market and start to grow your own vegetables and provide for your own needs. Whereas in an urban context, you're much more likely to take that income and then find a small amount of work on top. So I think, to me, basic income can support all sorts of things, but in a rural area, it could really support a movement towards a more self-provisioning community where you produce more of your own food and you sort of disconnect more from the global economy. Because we do a lot of that already where I live, but you know, with a basic income to support us, I think more people could do that. So maybe that's also relevant in parts of South Korea.
Thank you, Jin. It's been great to have you with us taking part this evening. We've come to the end of our meeting, so I want to thank Molly for giving us her time and enthusiasm and the benefit of her experience in economics and as a former MEP. Thank you very much on behalf of all of us. And thank you to everybody who's taken part. We were up to 36 participants at one point, which is really good and very worth while. So thank you for taking part, and if you've enjoyed it, please join us on another occasion.
Thank you all very much. It's lovely to see you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.